Welcome to Drive the Daf, clear, structured explanation of the daily daf in 20 minutes. You can even follow in the car.
Eruvin Daf Kuf Gimel begins after a Mishnah and contains two more Mishnayos. One subject, however, runs throughout the daf and all the Mishnayos, and as we're discussing where there are certain malachos that are permitted in the Beis HaMikdash and forbidden outside the Beis HaMikdash. And there's a essential machlokas that runs through the daf between the Rabbanon, Rabbi Eliezer, and possibly Rabbi Shimon. And that is the question of when there is a certain malacha that you're allowed to do because of a mitzvah. Meaning there's a mitzvah that pushes away Isser Shabbos. It allows you to violate a malacha on Shabbos, such as a bris milah, or bringing certain karbonos, or korban pesach, or the Levium playing their musical instruments. These things push away the halachas of Shabbos. You're allowed to be mechalel Shabbos. You're allowed to do these malachas on Shabbos. The question that's discussed is, what about preparing for those mitzvah? Not doing the mitzvah itself, but preparing it, setting up for it. You're allowed to violate Hilchos Shabbos in order to do that as well. And there are three possible positions that can be taken here. Rabbi Eliezer says, yes, you're allowed to, unconditionally, even if you could have prepared already before Shabbos and you didn't. You're still allowed to do those preparations on Shabbos, just like the mitzvah pushes away Shabbos, its preparations push away Shabbos. Now, the Chachamim, the Gemara will say, hold not that way. The Gemara introduces that at the beginning of the daf. They say that you are allowed to be Mechal Shabbos, to do the Machshirin, to prepare for the mitzvah, which is Doche Shabbos, but only if you couldn't have done it before Shabbos. If you could have done it before Shabbos, then you can't do it on Shabbos. Rabbi Shimon, the Gemara will say, holds that you can't do any Machshirin at all. And the Gemara has some change in his approach as to what the reason for that is. Is it he just holds that you can't do it at all, or is it that he holds that there's a gzeira under certain circumstances? But those are the three positions. So the first case that's under discussion here is tying a string on a harp that snapped, and the Levium want to tie it up. So what the Gemara, what the Mishnah we had seen says is that they're allowed to tie it, but they're not allowed to install it in the first place. And that contradicts the brisa that says they're not allowed to tie it, they're only allowed to make a bow, which is a type of knot which is permitted on Shabbos. So the Gemara had asked, what is the resolution of the contradiction? The Mishnah says you're allowed to tie it, but only if it broke, not in the first place. And the brisa says that you are only allowed to make a bow, meaning you're not allowed to be Mechal Shabbos, to tie the string. And we wanted to understand what is the difference between the Mishnah and the Brisa. We tried a couple of explanations. The Gemara here brings its next explanation, and it'll have three. It says, first of all, maybe the Mishnah is the Rabbanan who say that we're referring to a case where you could not have fixed it before Shabbos, it broke on Shabbos, and that's where you're allowed to fix it on Shabbos. However, the Brisa is Rabbi Shimon who says you're not allowed to, you're only allowed to make a bow, you're not allowed to be Mechal Shabbos in order to fix the string. Now, the Gemara has another pshat here. The Gemara notes that in the case of the string, there's the third opinion, that is Reb Shimon ben Elazar, who says that you can never tie a string with a bow in the middle. You can't even tie it with a knot. What you have to do is replace the string. And he says that the reason is because it won't make a sound if you have a knot in the middle of the string. The Gemara's second approach is that there is no machlokes between the Mishnah and the Brisa. It's practical. And the thing is as follows: if it snaps in the middle and you make a bow to fix it, it won't sound good. If it snaps all the way on the end, then you can fix it with a bow and the sound will be fine. And that's the difference. The Mishnah is referring to where it snapped in the middle, and therefore to make a bow wouldn't work, and therefore it says you can make a knot. The Brisa is referring to where it snapped all the way on the end, and over there if you make a bow it's okay, and therefore it's preferable to make the bow. Now the Gemara's third explanation is again that the Mishnah is a Rabbanan and the Brisa is Reb Shimon, except that here we're not going to say that Reb Shimon holds that you're not allowed to do anything in order to prepare for this mitzvah on Shabbos. It's not that he holds it away, it's really he holds that you could. The problem here is that we only allow you to do it if it snapped in the middle. If it snapped at the end, we wouldn't allow you to do it, because there you don't have to retie it, you could just make a bow. So when we're saying that you're allowed to make a knot, so Reb Shimon says, we don't let you make a knot even in the middle. Gzera, you may come to make a knot when it's on the end, and there you didn't have to make a knot, you could have made a bow. which is not an Isser at all. The Chacham say, no, we don't make Gzeira, and therefore if it snaps in the middle, you're allowed to make a knot because that's the only way to practically fix it. If it snaps on the end, you can't make a knot, you can only make the bow. We don't make Gzeira, therefore you allow you to make a knot in the middle of the string, you'll end up making a knot even when it's on the end, and you didn't have to. We now begin the next Mishnah, which is about a different subject, but it is relevant to the same machlokes between the Chachamim and Rabbi Eliezer. This Mishnah discusses the subject of cutting a wart off an animal. Now, cutting a wart off an animal, if you were to do it with a kli, it would be an Isser Daraisa of Goizeiz. If you were to do it by hand, it would be an Isser Darbanan because it's with a Shinoi. So now the Mishnah says you're not allowed to do it outside the Beis HaMikdash, that's for sure Aser, there's no heter. Why should you be allowed to? In the Beis HaMikdash, it is a machshir, it's a preparation for being able to bring the animal as a carbon. Carbonas are permitted on Shabbos, and you would have to cut off the wart in order to prepare it to be a carbon because a wart is considered a mum. You can't bring a animal with a wart on the Mizbeach. So the Mishnah, our Mishnah doesn't say who it is, but it does say the following halacha. It says that to cut off a wart in the Beis HaMikdash to enable the mitzvah of bringing the carbon, which is allowed on Shabbos, so cutting off the wart, you're allowed to do it by hand, but not with a kli. That's what our Mishnah's psak is. Now the Gemara begins and right away asks a problem. We have a brisa that quotes two opinions on the subject. The Chachamim say that you are not allowed to cut off a wart on Shabbos, even for the Mikdash, and Rabbi Eliezer says you are. So neither of those opinions fit with our Mishnah. Our Mishnah had said that it depends if that by hand you're allowed to, with a kli you're not allowed to. So that doesn't fit in either of these. So Gemara offers four resolutions to this problem. First of all, we'll have two, and then after finishing to discuss two, we'll have a third and a fourth. So the first two are Rabbi Elazar against the Amir, Rabbi Elazar and Rabbi Yossi ben Chanina. The Gemara doesn't know who says which one says what, but the two answers are as follows. The first answer is that our Mishnah that differentiates between a kli and a hand is the opinion of the Chachamim, and in the Brisa they didn't differentiate because they were talking about with a kli. They didn't say with a kli, but that's what they were referring to, and therefore it fits perfectly. The other opinion is that no, our Mishnah was referring to where you are cutting off a dried wart. That's not considered part of the animal's body anymore. It's considered to be dead skin, and therefore it's not a problem. Where it's moist and still fresh, that's where the Chachamim say in the Mishnah that it's forbidden even to do it by hand. Now the Gemara compares and contrasts these two resolutions to the contradiction. The Gemara first of all says that opinion that said that the resolution is that in the Brisa where the Chachamim said that it's aser, that was where it was dry, but in our where it was wet, where it was fresh. But our Mishnah that said that it's permitted by hand, that's where it was dry. The problem with this answer, and the reason why the other one doesn't want to hold of it, is because you can't tell me that our Mishnah is referring to when it's dried, because if it's dried, it would be permitted even with a kli. There's no iser at all. That's the problem with this approach. The problem with the other approach, to say that the Brisa, where the Chachamim say it's aser, is just referring to where there's a kli, so why do you need to tell me that? We could see it clearly in our Mishnah here that if there's a kli, it's aser. What are you adding over there? So the Gemara answers in each one for the other opinion. The reason why I needed to tell you the Mishnah over there, the other Brisa, it's actually not a Brisa, it's a Mishnah in Pesachim. The reason why I need to bring you the Mishnah in Pesachim, which adds and repeats again the halacha, that it is forbidden, and it's referring to when it's with a kli. The reason why I have to add that is to show you there that Rabbi Eliezer argues. I wouldn't have seen that just from our Mishnah alone. It doesn't say Rabbi Eliezer's opinion. And the other approach, which says that our Mishnah is referring to when it is dried, the Gemara does not defend that. The Gemara just notes that according to the opinion who understands the Mishnah in Pesachim, that says that the Chachamim say that it's forbidden, that's referring to when it's only with a kli, but that by hand it's permitted. The Gemara says that this opinion didn't want to say that way, because it can't be that it's with a kli. Because if it's a kli, it would be an Isser Daraisa. And that Mishnah, it includes two more halachas. It talks about bringing it in from outside the tchum, and it talks about carrying it on Shabbos. Now those are both Isuri D'Rabbanan. Bringing Tchumen is an Isser D'Rabbanan, and carrying a live creature, we have a rule Chai Nosi it's Atzmai, and therefore it really carries itself. You carrying it is only an Isser D'Rabbanan. These are both Isuri D'Rabbanan. So you can't tell me that Mishnah is referring to where it was a Kli, because that's an Isser D'Oraisa. It wouldn't fit together with the other cases in the Mishnah. So Gemara says no, but the other opinion doesn't have a problem with that, because he holds that those other two are actually Isurei D'Oraisa. He holds that Chai Nosi is Atzmai, the fact that it's a living creature doesn't make it a Midrabanan, and he holds like Rabbi Akiva, who holds that Tchumen is actually an Isur D'Oraisa. Now the Gemara rejects this. The Gemara says that Rabbi Yosef rejects this, and he says you cannot tell me that we are referring to an Isur D'Oraisa over here, that we're referring to cutting off the wart with a Kli. Can't be, because in that Gemara, commenting on that Mishnah, the Gemara quotes that Rabbi Eliezer, who's one of the disputants in that Mishnah, says, I'm going to prove to you my opinion, because these are only Isuri D'Rabbanan. And since you're allowed to do an Isur D'Oraisa, you're allowed to shecht korbanos on Shabbos, so certainly you're allowed to do an Isur D'Rabbanan. So you see clearly that Rabbi Eliezer is saying that what we are arguing about here is an Isur D'Rabbanan, and the Chachamim don't respond and say, no, I was talking about an Isur D'Oraisa, so they're both talking about an Isur D'Rabbanan. So obviously to say that it's with the Kli is the wrong answer. So therefore Rabbi Eliezer gives his own approach. And he says that what's happening here is as follows. The Mishnah we learned here in Eruvin is talking about regular karbanos. The Mishnah Mesachim is talking about a karban Pesach. There's a big difference between karbanos and a karban Pesach. A karban Pesach, people find warts at home. Karbanos in the Beis HaMikdash, they find the warts in the Beis HaMikdash. The halacha is that you are allowed to violate an Isser in order to prepare for a mitzvah that pushes away Shabbos. So you're allowed to cut off warts, but only in the Beis HaMikdash itself. The only reason you're allowed to do this Isser is because you're bringing it in the Beis HaMikdash. In the Beis HaMikdash itself, you're allowed to cut off the warts. Outside the Beis HaMikdash, like the karban Pesach, where you found it over there, the Chachamim say that it's Asr. So the contradiction between the Mishnah and the Mishnah in Pesachim does not exist. Our Mishnah is saying you're allowed to cut it off by hand. That's talking about regular karbanos where you're in the Beis HaMikdash. In Pesachim is talking about karban Pesach, and over there the Chachamim say you're not allowed to because it's outside the Beis HaMikdash. Now the Gemara is going to have two challenges to this concept that Rabbi Yosef is teaching us, that you're only allowed to prepare for a mitzvah and violate a halacha of Shabbos in order to do that in the Beis HaMikdash. The Gemara is going to bring two examples over here where you're apparently allowed to do that outside the Beis HaMikdash, and that therefore is problematic on Rabbi Yosef's assertion. So the Gemara's first example is talking about a Sefer Kodesh. You're holding a Sefer, a scroll, and it drops from your hand, and it rolls out into Rosh Hashanah. So the Gemara, we had seen this Mishnah, it says that you're allowed to roll it back up. So the Gemara is comparing this to the case of a Mikdash, because the Gemara is understanding the reason why you're allowed to roll it up is because of the Kedusha of the Sefer. So it's very similar to the Mikdash. However, this is outside the base of Mikdash, and we're allowing you to roll it up, even though you're doing a potential Isser. It's an Isser D'Rabbanan that you're not allowed to roll things up lest you drop it from your hand and still roll it up, which would be an Isser D'Oraisa. So how come we're allowing you to do it here? So Gemara answers, the Gemara says, didn't we already establish that this case is talking about where you were sitting on a threshold, which is a carmelis, and then rolled out into Rosh Hashanah. So even if it'll drop from your hand and you'll go roll it up, it's only in Isser D'Rabbanan. That's why we didn't make Gzeira and say that you're not allowed to roll it up, because the entire Isser, even if you were to do something wrong, would only be Midrabanan. This heter has nothing to do with Mikdash. There's nothing to do with the fact that it's a Kedusha of the Sefer, and therefore it has nothing to do with our subject, but really the heter of doing things for the Mikdash is only in the Mikdash, as Rav Yosef said. Okay, the Gemara's second challenge is from the halacha of lowering a karban Pesach into an oven to cook on Shabbos. So it says you're allowed to do that. Now what about the Isser? You're not allowed to cook on Shabbos, you're not allowed to leave things on the fire on Shabbos because of a Gzer, you may come to stoke the coals. How come you're allowed to do that? Obviously, you see from here that the fact that it's a karban Pesach and you're not in the Beis HaMikdash is not a reason to prevent you from having this heter. You're allowed to do the heter anyway because it's for a karban, and therefore that's against Rav Yosef, who says you only have a heter to violate Isurim in the Mikdash itself, not outside the Mikdash. Here we see that you can't. So Gemara says this question was asked to Abaye and he didn't answer. When Rav Yosef heard about it, he said, why didn't you answer and say that there's different? Because there's an entire group of people doing a karban, so they will warn each other and they'll be careful with each other and they won't come to stoke the coals, and therefore Chazal never made a Gzeira D'Rabbanan there. And that's why it's permitted, not because of Mikdash. and therefore the fact that it's outside the mikdash is not a problem. There's a special heter there. So Gemara says Abai didn't want to say that answer because Abai felt that we only say that there's a group of people. We'll be careful about kahanim, about regular people bringing a carbon. Pesach, we don't say that concept. Okay, now the Gemara brings the fourth and final answer to see how our Mishnah fits with that Mishnah in Pesachim, and this is Rava. And Rava says that our Mishnah is really Rabbi Eliezer. And Rabbi Eliezer, who said that you're allowed to be Mechalel Shabbos in order to cut off a wart in the Mishnah in Pesachim, that's him. And here we're saying that you have to do it by hand. What's the reason? The reason is because even Rabbi Eliezer agrees that where you could do it by hand, with an extra shini, you could do things differently, you should. And therefore here, where you could do it by hand, it's not surprising that he says you could. Now, the Gemara wants to show that this is true, that Rabbi Eliezer holds that even though it's mutter, you should still do a shino, you should do it in a strange, different way as much as you can. The Gemara is going to show this from a brisa discussing a kohen who got a wart on his body. Now, a kohen is not allowed to do the avodah with a wart on his body. It's a mum, he has to have it removed. It says, but it's Shabbos, so what can he do? So we have a brisa that says somebody else should bite it off him. Use his teeth, not a kli, and should be done by somebody else, not by him. That's two shinuyim. That's two different things. Number one, it's being bitten off, and number two, somebody else is doing it. He's not doing it himself. Now the Gemara asks, why two shinuyim? So we have a machlokes elsewhere between the same people, between the same Rabbi Eliezer and the same Chachamim, that the Chachamim say biting something off the body is an Isser D'Rabbanan, anywhere, this is wherever you are, and Rabbi Eliezer says it's an Isser D'Oraisa. So now the Gemara says, oh, now, let's see who is the author of this. If it is the Rabbanan, so then biting off is an Isser D'Rabbanan already, so then why should I need somebody else to do it? It's an Isser D'Rabbanan in the Beis HaMikdash, L'Tzairech Shabbos, should be fine. L'Tzairech Mitzvah, should be fine. It must be that it's Rabbi Eliezer, and therefore even if somebody's got even biting off, the action of biting off is an Isser D'Oraisa, and therefore it would not be allowed in the Beis HaMikdash. The only way it's permitted is because it's L'Tzarech Mitzvah, and there's a heter. Rabbi Eliezer holds that everything that's L'Tzarech Mitzvah is okay. Still, he goes and says you should do an extra thing. You should go and have somebody else do it for you. So obviously it's Rabbi Eliezer, and he still says that any shina you could do, you should do. So the Gemara rejects this, and the Gemara says not necessarily. Maybe it's really the Chachamim. I asked me if it's a Chachamim, why should somebody else do it for him? He's allowed to do it himself. It's a shvus. It's a Rabbanan in the Beis HaMikdash. Gemara says very simply, maybe the wart was growing in a place that he can't reach with his teeth himself. Therefore, somebody else has to do it for him. That's why he says that. The Gemara says, one second, but that doesn't make sense. If you tell me that it's the Chachamim, so then how come he has to bite it off? Why doesn't he just take it off with his fingers? That would also be only midrabanan. Now we'd seen a discussion in a different Masechta whether this machlokes between Rabbi Eliezer and the Chachamim that it's only an Isser D'Rabbanan if you do it with a shinoi, if that applies to fingers or not. So it should have said here fingers, and then that would solve that problem for us. We would know that you're allowed to do it. Fingers is only a shvus. It's an important thing for us to know. So Gemara says very funny. You want to prove therefore that it has to be Rabbi Eliezer, according to you that it's Rabbi Eliezer. Why does it say to bite it off and not to do it with the fingers? You should have the same heter. You want to do a shino as much as you can. Do it with the hand. Why should it be with the fingers? Do it with the fingers. Why does it have to be with the teeth? So Gemara says no. That I can understand. Rabbi Eliezer wants you to do as big a shino as you can, and he wants you to do it with the teeth, which is very different than doing it with a kli, because he's afraid if you do it with your hand, you may end up doing it with a kli, because they're very similar. Therefore, he says do it with your teeth. But according to Chachamim, if it's a derabanan, it's a derabanan. What's the difference? It doesn't make sense to make Xer. The only reason that it's heter here, anyway, is because it's in the mikdash. Okay, we now begin the next Mishnah. This is the final one for the daf. The Mishnah says that if a Kohen has a wound on his finger, he is allowed to tie a reed around it in order to protect it, even though it's healing. We don't say that it's aser, but he's allowed to tie the reed around it because it's covered for the avodah that he not have an open wound. Even though it's healing, that's okay. We are going to forego the Isser D'Rabbanan of a healing medical treatment on Shabbos. Now, this is only in the mikdash. Outside the mikdash, of course, that's forbidden. And of course, you also can't wrap the reed around it in order to squeeze out blood. That would be an Isser of causing bleeding. on Shabbos, and that has nothing to do with the avoda, so therefore there will be no heter for that. So the upshot of this mission is that he's allowed to wrap the reed around his finger. The discussion in the Gemara will be that there is two additional problems with having a reed wrapped around your finger while you're trying to do the avoda. Problem number one is that it could be extra clothing. The Kohen is only allowed to wear the 4 big day kahuna. He's not allowed to wear extra things. And the other problem is that it could be a chatzitza. His hand has to be touching the kli that he's using. And here he has this thing on his finger. So the Gemara, there's two versions of this Gemara. In the first version, the initial discussion is about extra clothing, and then the Gemara asks, what about why is chatzitza not a problem? In the second version, we were discussing chatzitza the whole time. Either way, we're going to have a machlokes Rav Yehuda and Rav Yechanan, Rav Yehuda brother Rav Chia and Rav Yechanan, and then the Gemara will bring in Rava. According to the first version, it won't fit with Rava. According to the second version, Rav Yechanan will fit with Rava, and either way we're going to try to see if Rav Yehuda fits with Rava. So first of all, what is this discussion here? So according to the first version, Rav Yehuda brother Rav Chia says you have the reed is not a problem of extra clothing because it's just a reed. But were you to use a belt, a small little finger belt, that would be extra clothing and that would be a problem. Rav Yechanan says no, it's not a problem. The extra clothing is only in the place where the big dekuna are supposed to go. Something on your finger, there's no big dekuna there, and therefore there's no problem of that. Now the Gemara says, well, what about chatzitza? So the Gemara says chatzitza is not a problem. Rav Yechanan at least says chatzitza is not a problem because either it's on your left hand, you do that with your right hand, or it's on the back of your hand, and it's not in a place where it would interfere with any of your avoda at all. Now, Rava said that there is an Isser Chatzitza, and Rashi learns that the Gemara here is actually referring to extra clothing. That's what he means when it says Chatzitza. The Isser does apply even in a place where you don't wear the big day kahuna, as long as the clothing is larger than 3 tvachim, than 3 fingers by 3 fingers. Now, Rav Yechanan here didn't make a distinction how large it is. He just said it doesn't apply if it's not in a place where the big kahuna is meant to go. So Rava definitely doesn't fit with Rav Yechanan. The question is, does he fit with Rav Yehuda? Because Rav Yehuda talked about the belt. The belt is smaller than 3 tvachim, so it seems like Rav Yehuda would hold that it's a problem, even though it's smaller than the shear that Rava said. So Gemara says, no, it could be that Rav Yehuda really fits with Rava. The only reason that he said that it applies to the belt, even though it's smaller than Rava's shear, is because the belt is actually a formed clothing article that has a special hashivos, has a special importance to it. It's not just a cloth. It's actually a thing, and therefore even Rava would agree that that is a problem of chatzitza or extra begadim. Now the Gemara brings the second version of this, and like we said, the second version, the whole discussion is about chatzitza. Yehuda brother Rav Chia says that the reed is not a chatzitza, but a little belt would be a chatzitza. Rav Yechanan says it's not a chatzitza because it's not in the place of wearing the clothing. Gemara says that fits perfectly with Rava because Rava said as long as it's less than 3, it's not a problem. And Rav Yechanan said this isn't a problem because it's small. And this is, well, he didn't say because it's small, but it is a small thing. So it fits with Rava. The Gemara says, what about Rav Yehuda, who seems to say that it is a problem, even though it's less than 3 by 3, and Rava said it has to be 3 by 3 to be a problem. The Gemara says, no, because here it's chashav, then Rava would agree that it's a problem. The Gemara just asks now, according to Rabbi Yechanan, that even if it would be a small belt, it would be permitted because it's small enough. So it's not a chatzitza, so why did the Mishnah talk about where you're wrapping a reed? Why didn't it talk about this small thing here? This belt. So Gemara answers, we're teaching an extra chiddush here. Even though the reed has curative medical properties, still you're allowed to do it, and it's not usher for that.
Drive the Daf is a project of the Grand Woodlands Shul and is presented by Rabbi Yitzchak Landa. Find us on YouTube or subscribe to daily emails by emailing drivethedaf@gmail.com.